So, here's the million-dollar question, right? As AI gets smarter and smarter, is it just inevitable that it's going to become conscious? I mean, this is totally jumped from the pages of sci-fi right into our real-world debates. So in this explainer, we're going to try to cut through all that noise, all the hype, and get down to a really fundamental question. What even is consciousness, and could a machine ever truly have it?
Yeah, this quote from Sherry Turkle really hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? Technology can make us forget what we know about life. Because that's what we're really talking about here. We're about to dive deep into the huge, huge difference between a machine that can think and a living being that actually feels and experiences its world.
I mean, it feels like everywhere you look, movies, news headlines, there's this idea that AI is on some kind of fast track to consciousness. But here's the thing. This idea isn't just about the tech getting better. Nope. It's also being pushed along by some really deep-seated biases we all have as humans. It turns out our own psychology might be the real reason we're so ready to believe there's a ghost in the machine.
Okay, so think of these 4 biases like ingredients in a really potent cocktail, one that creates this powerful illusion. You've got anthropocentrism, human exceptionalism, the whole shebang. And what happens is, when we see an AI talking and writing just like us, our brains just instinctively fill in the gaps. We start projecting feelings, a sense of self, real consciousness onto it. We just can't help it. We're wired to see ourselves in the things we create.
All right, so let's really get into the weeds here. Because if we're ever going to get past this myth, we have to get super, super clear about 2 very different things that we are constantly mashing together. And those 2 things are intelligence and consciousness. So check this out. What's so important here is how cleanly we can separate what a system does from what it's like to be that system. So intelligence, that's all about performance, right? Solving puzzles, learning new things, hitting its goals. But consciousness, that's something else entirely. It's about subjective experience. It's that inner movie that's always playing, you know? The feeling of what it's like to be you. To put it really simply, one is about doing and the other is about being.
You know, this whole idea of a conscious AI, it's really built on one giant assumption. It's called computational functionalism, but don't worry about the fancy name. The core belief is pretty simple. Your mind is basically software, and your brain, that's just the wetware, the biological computer that it happens to be running on. And if that's true, well then you could theoretically take that mind software and run it on any kind of hardware you want, including, you guessed it, a bunch of silicon chips.
Okay, so there's this classic thought experiment that really seems to back up this mind as software idea. Imagine this. We take one of your brain cells, just one, and replace it with a tiny silicon chip that does the exact same job. You probably wouldn't feel a thing, right? Now what if we do 100, 1,000? We keep going until your entire brain is made of silicon, but it behaves exactly the same way. So here's the question. At what point did you fade away? It's really hard to say, isn't it? It feels like your consciousness should still be there, and that's the powerful hook of this idea. But what if this whole neat and tidy experiment is just completely missing the point about the deep, messy reality of biology?
And that leads to this absolutely crucial point. For a brain, you just can't separate the hardware from the software. They're the same thing. A neuron's job isn't just about zapping electrical signals back and forth. No, its function is totally tangled up with its very existence. Its metabolism, its chemistry, its actual physical shape. You can't separate what it does from what it is.
And this quote just nails it perfectly. Nothing gets wet in a weather forecasting computer. Think about that. A supercomputer can simulate a hurricane with incredible detail, right down to the last drop of rain. But inside that computer, nothing is actually getting wet. The simulation, no matter how perfect, is not the real thing. And simulating a brain's functions, well, that's just not the same as creating a real, living, conscious mind.
Okay, so all of this points us toward a really powerful alternative. What if consciousness isn't some kind of computational trick at all? What if it's a fundamentally biological phenomenon? What if it's simply a property of being alive?
And this is where a key idea called autopoiesis comes in. It's a Greek word that just means self-production, and it's a game changer. Think about it. A factory is built by something else to make things. It's other-producing. A computer is built to run programs. But a living cell is constantly, actively in the business of remaking and maintaining itself. For a living system, there's just no line between the thing doing the work and the work being done.
So if consciousness is tied to life,
How does a living thing actually experience the world? Well, get ready for this, because it's a wild idea. There's a theory that our perception, what we see and hear and feel, isn't a passive window into the world at all. Instead, our brain is constantly making its best guess about what's out there, and then generating our reality from the inside out. In other words, our conscious experience is a kind of controlled hallucination.
And why on earth would the brain do that? Why generate this controlled hallucination? Well, it all comes down to the most fundamental biological mission there is: stay alive. The brain's predictions are all about regulating the body. It's a process called allostasis, keeping everything in that sweet spot where you don't, die. Just think about that for a second. Our most basic, fundamental feeling of just being here, it's directly wired into our body's constant, moment-to-moment struggle for survival.
Okay, so if we run with this idea that consciousness is fundamentally tied to being alive, what does that mean for the future of AI? Well, it means we're walking into a future with two very different and equally terrifying ethical minefields ahead of us.
And this really lays out the two sides of the coin, the two massive risks. On one hand, you have the risk of creating actually conscious AI. If we create something that can genuinely feel, we might be opening a Pandora's box of suffering that we can't even begin to understand. But on the other hand, and this is the one that's probably coming sooner, is the risk of creating AI that just seems conscious. And that shoves us into a really murky, dangerous moral gray area.
Yep, this is basically the Westworld scenario, right? If we get used to talking to and interacting with AIs that seem totally real, but we keep telling ourselves, oh, it's just a machine, how are we going to treat them? If we start treating them like things, without any empathy, we risk making ourselves ethically numb. We risk coarsening our own moral fiber, and that could make it a whole lot harder to feel empathy for the actual conscious beings all around us, like other people. And that's why this warning from the philosopher Daniel Dennett is so important. He basically says, look, all we're going to see in our own lifetimes are intelligent tools, not colleagues. He's telling us the real challenge is to maintain some psychological distance. We have to constantly remind ourselves that no matter how good they get at faking it, they are tools. They are not our friends, not our colleagues, and fighting that urge to see them as human-like is going to be absolutely essential.
And really, this brings us to the core takeaway of this whole thing. When we boil down the incredible richness of our own lives, our feelings, our bodies, that deep biological drive to just keep going, when we reduce all that to just information processing, we're not just overestimating the machines. We are profoundly, deeply underestimating ourselves. Which leaves us with one last, really challenging question to chew on. As these AI systems get woven deeper and deeper into our daily lives, and as their performance becomes more and more perfect, will that line between seeming conscious and being conscious even matter to us anymore? That is a question we are all going to have to answer, and probably sooner than we think.